Hey guys, I'm Will Martin. Today is National First Responder Day in the United States. That is October 28th. It became official in 2019 when the Senate passed a bipartisan resolution designating October 28th as the day. The family of Sean Collier, a police officer ambushed during events related to the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, proposed a day to honor all people designated as first responders, including law enforcement, firefighters, and EMS. I'm especially grateful for the recognition of EMS, which includes all of those who serve on ambulances, rescue squads, and those who perform communication duties, such as the public safety call takers and the dispatchers. You know, it wasn't until a 1966 federal study called Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society, named accidental injuries as the leading cause of death in the first half of lifespan. The report showed that vehicle accidents alone during 1965 killed more Americans than were lost in the entire Korean War, and stated that seriously wounded citizens would fare better in a war zone than on the average city street. The report also pointed out the lack of regulation or standards for ambulance operations or provider training. The report made several recommendations for both managing and preventing accidental injuries, including the standardization of emergency training for rescue squad personnel, policemen, firemen, and ambulance attendants. Now, this standardization led to the first nationally recognized curriculum for EMTs. The 1970s, in my opinion, were the laboratory for development of emergency medical technician training. Here in New York, the first EMTs were actually called METs, or medical emergency technicians. It eventually got switched around to EMT by the time I came around in 1980. But like I said, the 1970s were really the bedrock for EMS. Colleges and universities such as UCLA and Eastern Kentucky were the first to invite national accreditors to review their EMT programs. Several college programs followed as well, and of course local county and government agency sponsorships of EMS training were the norm. The first training program I took in New York State was a certified first responder course, which was kind of like an EMT light. And that was followed for me by EMT and then EMT3 or level 3 EMT, which allowed advanced airway training, IVs, the use of a defibrillator, and the ability to give drugs, mostly in the event of cardiac arrest. If any of you are old enough to remember the television repairman who would come to your house to fix your old tube TV, they always had this big, gigantic box that folded out, and it contained all their tools and spare tubes. Well, those boxes were perfect for early EMS, and that's what we had on our ambulances. We also had the Life Pack 2, which weighed a ton. And we didn't intubate back then. We didn't intubate the trachea. Instead, we intubated the esophagus with an esophageal obturator airway. We used military anti-shock trousers, also known as mass trousers, to tamponade lower extremity bleeding or auto-transfuse blood to the core, and also to stabilize severely bleeding lower extremity injuries like gunshot wounds. We had to ask permission to do almost everything back in those days, so we had that red box, a telemetry radio that was often used by Roy DeSoto and Johnny Gage on the television show Emergency. And speaking of that show, if you were to name one catalyst for the promotion of EMS and firefighters, one reason why most of us got involved in EMS back then, it was because of that show. For most of you probably not familiar with that show, it portrayed two Los Angeles County firefighters who became paramedics. And that was a term that was foreign to most of the country outside of the West Coast back in the early 70s. It was a fictional show, but it showed all of us what EMS could do. It also made most of the country familiar with terms such as the jaws of life, otherwise known as the Hearst tool. It was used to cut apart cars and spread tight areas and a whole lot more. For that matter, they often used a porta-power. It was a hand pump tool that used hydraulics to manually spread apart metal. I happened to use one of those back in my first few years back in the fire department. And then eventually we got our own hearse tool. But most of what we used back in those early days of EMS were direct descendants of experience on the battlefield, mostly from the Korean War and the Vietnam War. EMS has come a long way. The first paramedic program in my area started as a pilot program in the early 80s. I was really fortunate to be a part of that, and we graduated our first full paramedic program in 1985. That same year, I was also fortunate enough to be selected for our first flight medic program. Now, I want to point something out here. I was a paid paramedic, but most of what I did, and still do today, is volunteer. Back in the 70s and 80s, almost all ambulance companies were completely volunteer. At that time, a community could support a fully volunteer ambulance, and they did it on donations alone. That included vehicles and maintenance, a building, supplies, manpower. What a great period of time that was. We had people from literally all walks of life volunteering to be on the ambulance. Lawyers, truck drivers, mechanics, real estate agents, nurses, accountants, business owners, all types. And we staffed volunteer ambulances 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, how were we able to do that back then? I think it was because each community had a lot of pride and people felt the need to help out in their community. It was a different time, and I'm talking about the 70s and the 80s, but it certainly goes back farther than that with the creation of volunteer fire departments, for example. It's just crazy looking back on how any community could possibly do that today. They just simply can't do it. Costs are too high, and the public's desire to get out and help just, at least in my opinion, isn't there like it used to be. Most people today just figure they pay their taxes and they deserve these types of services in return. I know that the training has become so much more extensive today, and I know that that precludes a lot of people from undertaking things like EMT training, much less paramedic training. Same thing with volunteer firefighting. When I joined the fire department in 1981, most of the training was done in-house. We did have some state courses to take, but they weren't a crazy number of hours. Today, I can't begin to estimate the number of hours it takes to become an EMT or a paramedic if you're starting from scratch, or a firefighter for that matter. Now, I recently rejoined my local volunteer fire department in April of this year. I just passed my 6-month mark, and so I'm officially allowed to vote, and so I'm a full member of the department again. I was a member of this department for 14 years, but I left when my kids were little and my work took over just about every free moment. That was 19 years ago. I missed it terribly, though. I had previously been in another department for 10 years before that, and that gave me 24 years of service in the fire department when I left. I'd also worked full-time as a paramedic for 10 years, so it was and it still is in my blood. Being back in the department is such a wonderful experience. I'll spend more time talking about that in another video, perhaps, if there's interest. If you're a current or former first responder, I'd love to hear what you think and where you serve and, what you think of EMS and firefighting in general. Despite all my years as an academic, a professor, or a nurse practitioner, I've always considered myself a paramedic and a firefighter. And it's so cool to see we have a day that recognizes all of us. So again, happy First Responders Day to every one of you. And if you're considering a career as a first responder, please consider subscribing to my channel because I'll have more to talk about it in the future. Until next time, thanks for watching.